Good morning, everyone. Weather's taken a turn for the worst, hasn't it? -2 when I got up this morning, so I hope no one's had to make any panicky phone calls back to the course to get everything sorted. Just before we start, I just need to give some essential information about the Queen's Suite. If the fire alarm sounds, which will be a loud siren, we must leave the building by the nearest exit immediately. The exits are through the doors to the auditorium and turn either left or right. Follow the fire escape signs down the staircase to street level. The assembly point is on the green opposite Exhibition Hall Q. You must not re-enter the building until authorized by a member of Harrogate International Centre staff or by a member of the North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. If you discover a fire, you should alert other delegates by shouting fire and operating the nearest alarm. Hopefully we'll all notice if there's a fire suddenly bursting out in this room, but yeah. So, my name's Rowan Rumball. I work as an ecological consultant for STRI. My background is working as an ecological consultant for a company called AECOM. We did lots of large infrastructure programs like HS2 and the Wilford Power Plant, which has just recently been cancelled, but I swear that's not my fault. And then I moved to STRI, where I've been taking all these ecological and environmental principles and applying them to golf courses. And hopefully today we're going to learn a little bit about how we can be environmentally sustainable for future benefit. Just before I get into the full swing of things proper, have we got mainly greenkeepers in the room? Or have we got, yep. So, okay, it just helps a little bit when I'm directing things, that I know like sort of what sort of department and where I should be aiming at. So, moving on. So the learning objectives today, well, those are some really basic PowerPoints of hopefully what everyone's going to leave with, but really what I want to give is a sense of climate change, how global warming affects climate change, and why global warming and climate change are two very distinct and different things, how this is going to affect golf courses, sports turf areas, and landscape in general, and how we can mitigate against these things. So hopefully everyone leaves here today understanding what are the best practices, what people can do to help prevent some of the potential disasters, well, the disasters that we're all living through right now. So I thought I would start with the definition of sustainability. Sustainability is a word that we've all heard a lot over BTME. It really is the buzzword of the moment for just about everything. And in a very, very basic sense, it means keeping things the same, keeping things level. Now, when we talk about sort of sustainability, we tend to talk about it in 3 different ways: environment, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. Now, if we think about this, we need to think about what the base level is. You know, what's the most important out of those 3? I mean, they're all important in their own individual ways, but what's the bedrock that supports all of those above it? Well, without the environment, we don't have anything. We don't have the places we can build houses. We don't have the landscape that we can play golf through. So when we don't have an environment, we can't have a social structure to be built upon that. And if we don't have a social structure, then we can't have an economy. All too commonly nowadays, we see this thought about in entirely the reverse. We tend to think about what are the financial implications for anything we do? And then how are those financial implications going to affect society? And it tends to be that environment gets kind of shoved to the side and ignored a little bit. If we start thinking about this in the opposite way, if we start thinking about how we can support the environment and how we can use the environment's ecosystem services, which is a concept I'll explain a little bit later, hopefully that will support the society and support the economy. So this is kind of very broad level stuff. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we can support the environment, and hopefully everyone will leave here with a little bit of a better idea how to do that, and everything else will kind of follow on from that. Sorry, excuse me a second. So, let's start with some of the really big things that are affecting the environment. The greenhouse effect. Well, what is the greenhouse effect? I've got this handy-dandy little chart here. That's going to hopefully help explain it a little bit. Basically, the sun emits solar radiation. It's what keeps it's what the majority keeps our planet warm. However, we have a big atmosphere in the way. And the atmosphere can work like a mirror in a lot of respects. A lot of solar radiation will be reflected out back into the sky. Some of it will be absorbed by the atmosphere, some of it absorbed by the Earth's surface, some of it will be reflected. It's essentially like a very, very diffuse mirror almost. But how effective the atmosphere is as a mirror depends on its composition. So we're all familiar with the greenhouse gases, as they're called. They tend to be molecules which have carbon involved in them, so carbon dioxide, methane, other larger carbon molecules. And what these do effectively is that as the solar radiation is going through our atmosphere, they're absorbed, and then they tend to be released as heat in a random direction. So what you tend to find is that solar radiation hits the Earth's surface, gets reflected back again, but the higher proportion of these greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere, the more of it then gets reflected back again towards the surface. And this is what causes the greenhouse effect. Now, I'm going to make an important distinction here between the greenhouse effect and climate change. So the greenhouse effect, also known as global warming, is a general increase in the thermal energy that's being captured by the planet. Climate change is an effect that happens because of this general overall warming and increase in temperature. Yeah, sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit there. Changes in the composition of the atmosphere have influenced how heat is trapped and stored from the sun. It's worthwhile mentioning that a lot of people get a little bit confused because they hear about, the greenhouse effect is a natural thing. Temperatures rise and fall naturally as time goes on, and that is true. And there are many natural sources of greenhouse gases. I mean, animals are one. We all produce methane, and that is a greenhouse gas at the end of the day. But what humanity is doing is adding on top of that, that natural level, that natural curve increase in greenhouse gases, to the point where humans can probably be blamed for all temperature rise between, for half of the observed temperature rise between 1951 and 2010. It doesn't sound like too much when you consider the natural temperature rise between those two periods should be something like 0.01 degrees. So, you know, we're increasing the temperature by a very, very small amount. However, that small amount is, it's a curve. So what we're doing is we're shifting ourselves up on the timescale of global warming, of climate change, of how it would proceed naturally, very, very quickly. We're moving the whole timetable of that natural process forwards by thousands, tens of thousands of years. This increase in temperature is likely causing climate change. You'll notice I use the words like likely and probably enough. It's because science is an inexact science. And we can never be quite certain of things. And often a lot of the figures that I give in here are estimates for what's going to happen. And that produces a lot of the unsureness of how we can plan and how we can mitigate for these things going forwards. So another aspect of this is that as we get this warming, we'll notice that it just gets faster and faster and faster. A lot of the ways that these greenhouse gases are captured and stored by the environment tend to be destroyed by climate change, which doesn't really help anything. So forest fires, for example, when it comes to forest fires, the way that increases greenhouse gases and increases the speed of climate change isn't so much because of the fire itself, but rather because forests are really, really good for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequestering it or collecting it in the wood and the bark. So it's the long-term removal of carbon dioxide that we're losing in that case. Melting of Arctic ice. So as temperature increases, we're going to have melting of Arctic ice. In previous millennia, as that Arctic ice is built up, it's trapped a lot of methane and a lot of these older atmosphere kind of types, which tend to have a lot more methane and a lot more carbon dioxide in it. And as it's melting, that's getting released in big plumes that's being trapped in the ice. So the more ice that melts, the faster climate change. The faster climate change, the more ice that melts. And it's a big reciprocal system that just feeds on itself. So one of the ways, hopefully, I can change the way that you think about your courses, the courses that are managed or the courses that you visit, is to help think about them as a system, and a system that works in collaboration with everything else around it. The Earth is one big system. Here I've got a screenshot from a very interesting website, windy.com, highly recommend it. It's fascinating just to have as a screensaver, just to have it going in the background all the time. This is a map of the wind speeds around the world, and everything is interconnected here. You know, this cyclone system that we have going on in the middle of the Atlantic now is probably why we've got these cold temperatures right now, several weeks in advance. But that will also affect the other wind patterns on the other side of the world, and it's a constant swirling, mixed ball of gases, essentially. But the thing is that we can take that system, take the whole world as a system, and then we can look at courses and our landscape in England as a little enclosed system. And then we can look at even further detail that. We can look at counties as enclosed systems, and we can look at courses as enclosed systems. And in fact, a lot of what I'm talking about can kind of be scaled up and down drastically to the point where we probably have, however many people are in this room, we all have individual systems that would look quite similar to this within our own guts, within the own microbes and everything that live in our guts. Would probably develop a map that looked quite similar to this if you looked at like how they die off and the populations that live around there. So a lot of what I'm talking about can be scaled up and down very, very easily. As that map probably implies, the weather is incredibly hard to predict. And unfortunately, it influences all of us a lot more than a lot of the rest of the country. As we see this overall average temperature increase, this weather is going to become incredibly unpredictable to the point where predictions for how climate change is going to affect the UK suggest that we're actually not going to get desperately warmer in the UK. It's actually going to stay pretty stable. But what we are going to find is a lot more drought periods during summer, a lot heavier rainfalls, a lot more sort of tropical storm-like rainfalls, and wetter winters. So it's kind of like a shifting to the extremes rather than a constant damp, wet weather as we're also used to in the UK. But this climate change is also going to affect the whole world in a whole bunch of ways that are very unpredictable because the whole world is a system. Everything interacts with each other. We just looked at the wind there and how the wind all interacted. Well, the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to cause an increase in carbonic acid being generated in rain clouds. Basically, the carbon dioxide dissolves into the water breaks down the carbon dioxide, which is then reformed into carbonic acid, very basically. That's rained out over the oceans, and we're seeing acidification of the oceans, which is causing habitat change, which is causing wildlife loss. Sea level change is a very, very big one for all the links courses. Loss of land to the point where we're having to build defenses. You know, we're having to artificially manipulate the habitats just so we can maintain stability, just so we can stay sustainable. Soil degradation is one that's perhaps not so immediately obvious and perhaps doesn't sound so immediately threatening, but you know, we're standing on soil right now. Soil is absolutely everywhere and is a very fundamental part for what a lot of us do. Coral reef die-off, species loss. Climate change is going to affect us in a lot of different ways, in short. However, because the world is a system, because our mitigations are a system, everything that we do to help prevent this, to keep everything sustainable, is also then going to have follow-on impacts in ways which aren't always predictable. Sea defenses are a really good example of this. We'll build sea defenses. Sure, that will prevent us losing any more land, but it's also going to change how sand is being deposited along the coast. So if we build a line of sea defenses, then sand may get swept away from the front of those sea defenses a lot easier and get deposited somewhere else, perhaps much further away. And the areas on either side of the sea defenses are then going to be left loose to be degraded. Sand dunes are one of our rarest habitats. It only exists where the land meets the sea, which is a very small proportion of everything involved. And by building sea defenses, we're almost inadvertently, we're protecting our land, but we're inadvertently destroying and stabilizing this other habitat. Renewable woods is another good example. I mean, everyone thinks it's fantastic to have plantations, you know, big pine plantations, not be cutting down the rainforest to get all our wood for our construction, for our paper, and everything like that. However, the way that we do it causes extreme soil loss. And soil loss takes millennia, soil takes millennia to build up again. But we're losing it over tens of years. And soon, a lot of our highland areas, a lot of the areas where we have these forest plantations, we're not going to be able to use them as plantations anymore. Then when are we going to get our wood from? or we're going to have to innovate, we're going to have to change our cultural practices to deal with that. Really, every mitigation we have against climate change is a prevention of a natural process, is a disruption of stability almost. Stable for the natural environment is constant change, but we don't want constant change. We want things to stay stable for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the repercussions are hard to understand. Warming of waters is currently causing trout to grow really, really big. Fantastic. We've got bigger trout, we've got more fish. Perfect. That's a benefit of climate change. Except what's happening is the trout are growing bigger because there's more invertebrates for them to feed on. They eat all the invertebrates, they cause that ecosystem to collapse, and then all the trout die off very suddenly. Then we have no trout at all, because we've just fished up all the smaller trout that have come on, there's none left to reproduce, and we just run out of them. So there's a lot of varied and difficult predictions to be made in accordance with climate change. So how about we take this all back a second and we look at some of the more basic changes that climate change is perhaps going to have on a golf course itself. Well, last summer was a very good example of that. As the photo shows, we had a lot of grass die off. But also, we're going to be seeing more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's now a third more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the 1900s to now. So in this room right now, there is a third more carbon dioxide than there was 100 years ago. Not that this room existed, but you get what I mean. And what happens is the plants love that. They go, yippee, there's more carbon dioxide. We can build more plant and root structure. But then they start demanding more of other resources. They start demanding more nitrogen, start demanding more fertilizer. They uptake it all. They grow really vigorously, and then they run out of those resources, and they get stressed. So we're going to have to start thinking about cultural practices to deal with that. A stressed grass means it's more prone to disease, it's more prone to weeds coming in, it's more prone to invasive species. And at the end of the day, what this means is maintenance requirements are going to go up. You're going to have to cut more because you're going to have to be putting more fertilizer on to stop the grass from getting stressed. You're going to have to deal with weed and pest species more. Water management systems are going to become more and more important as time goes on. We have almost yearly droughts now. The government lets out yearly warnings that we're running out of water, and if we don't get significant rainfall early this year, we're going to be seeing an even worse one this following year. And at the end of the day, what's the first thing that always gets cut? The first thing that always gets cut is the environment whenever we have emergency situations like this. Soil is going to start becoming more acidic. With the increase in carbonic acid in the rainfall, we're going to start having more acid rain, and that's going to slowly but steadily change the very soil structure we have. And we're starting with milder winters and hot summers. We're starting to see winter diseases become summer diseases, and summer diseases become winter diseases, and diseases all year round, which 50 years ago, we never would have seen. I'm just going to take a short left turn here and discuss ecosystem services. Is everyone familiar with what ecosystem services mean? What they are as a concept? It's a concept which has been quite common within ecology and environmental circles, but hasn't really been talked about too much in other places. But it's a very, very important concept to consider when considering the value of why we want to preserve the environment in the first place. Very broadly speaking, it is the value we receive from non-human influenced habitats or just ecosystems in the environment in general. It's a very, very general term, just much like sustainability. On the right there, we have a graph, a very rough graph from an article back in 2014, estimating the value of ecosystem services. That 51,000, I realized, there you go, yes, it's in dollars per, well, that's in dollars per hectare per year. Yeah, basically, it's those numbers are the value that those systems have. Green is a positive increase in value, and red is a negative decrease on the right-hand side. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we get a lot of money, just straight value from the environments that surround us that is often kept invisible. A bee isn't going to fly up to you and ask you to watch it while it pollinates a flower. It's just going to go ahead and do it. We have to look for these values. The ecosystem's not just going to show itself to us. My favorite example of this is almond groves in America. So in America, they have lots of land, they have a lot of space, and they grow almond groves that are thousands of acres in size. They are truly massive. You could literally spend hours driving through them, and you'll see nothing but almond trees. And what they found was that in the center of these almond groves, because it's all just a monoculture of almond trees, they've killed off all the flying invertebrates. They haven't got that mix of habitats which you need to keep all these flying invertebrates alive. And those trees aren't producing almonds anymore, because there's nothing there to pollinate the almond blossom. So now they're paying beekeepers to take bees into the center of their almond groves just so they can get almonds from their almond tree, which seems baffling that we have to provide that much intervention just to get back what should be provided to us for free. The total number of value that we get from ecosystem services is predicted to be 3 times the global GDP. So 3 times of everything that we produce in money, of all money that changes hands across the world, we get from the environment in tourism, in pollination, in pest control, in wild food, in countries which are slightly less developed than the UK. It's just massive. And we really, really need to preserve that value. Otherwise, we could be seeing complete economic collapse, like at the start of this. We're focusing a lot on the economy, but not so much on the value that we get from the environment. Ecosystems are being impacted in loads of different ways. I can't even close to cover them all. You know, that's a degree level course. That's 3 years of studies trying to even just think about covering all the different ways that they're impacted. One of the really interesting things about golf in relation to ecosystem services is that they provide a lot of hidden value to the surrounding environment, which is normally just completely hidden away that no one sees. You know, golf courses produce a lot of butterflies, produce a lot of bees, they produce a lot of birds, they're very good at pest control. And I feel like we focus on golf courses a lot for the golf, and so quite rightly so, but we shouldn't ignore all the other benefits of this sport. And it's quite unique amongst sports. There aren't many other sports that provide these services to the surrounding areas quite like golf is. In fact, just recently, I think they're now called greater good payments. We're talking about the replacement of farming subsidies that are going to be provided from the EU when Brexit happens. And they're being called greater good payments, or goods for the, I can't remember the exact wording, but the point is that they're being called that because farms are being subsidized because they're providing these services. But we can't go to a farm and say, oh, I'll give you a $5 if a bee comes and pollinates my flower in my garden. It doesn't make any sense. So the government does that for us. And it's a bit of a task of mine is trying to encourage those sorts of payments also to be given to golf courses, because a golf course is providing exactly the same sort of value that farms are in that respect. So I don't understand why we don't have more of that going on within sports areas. Oh, that didn't work. There we go. So, like I was saying earlier on, sports turf is a system as well, just like the planet is. It all interacts in a lot of unique and individual ways. Going at the top, let's run through some of the examples of which climate change is going to affect sports turf. So we're going to see an increase in carbon dioxide. Increase in carbon dioxide leads to stressed turf, which leads to an increase in fertilizer, higher risk of microdochium, increased spending on fungicide treatments, if we have any fungicide treatments left in a few years. Okay, that doesn't seem great. More money being spent, we don't want to do that. More pesticides and everything like that being put into the environment, we don't want to do that. So what about the opposite? Okay, well then there's going to be a decrease in available nitrogen, and that's going to favor weeds that can fix nitrogen. So there's a very specific set of weeds that can take nitrogen in from the atmosphere and fix it and turn it into its own fertilizer. Clover is an example of this. So is gorse. If you're on a links course, gorse can also do this. And what we're finding, and what we'd find, is that all of a sudden now we have to start treating for those weeds. So it's a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. And we're going to have to start looking at managing sports turf areas in a very, very different way in order to deal with these upcoming problems. Another example is, as we have drier soils, I mean, everyone knows what wetting agents are for. They're there to get water into drier soils. We're just going to have more and more of a reliance on wetting agents in order to get water in there. And to prevent flooding. So going on to the sort of landscape in general. Sorry, excuse me. As I mentioned previously, climate change is a natural process. And we're fighting against natural processes in order to prevent, in order to mitigate what's going to happen, in order to keep things sustainable, in order to keep things stable. But what we're finding is that because of human influences, this change is happening on a drastically greater speed. Now, in previous years, in previous millennia even, this climate change has been met by the habitat, and because it's been so slow, the habitat's been able to grow and develop and prevent any kind of drastic changes in landscape. But what we're seeing now is that our ecosystem isn't able to keep up with that. Most extreme example of this is predictions of a 0.6 meter increase in sea levels by 2080 around the UK. Now that's not, I should say, that's not the highest sea level, that's the average sea level. So what we'll find is that as the average sea level goes up, the extremes will also increase and decrease at much greater levels, and we'll see flooding. In fact, there have been some predictions that England could lose 40% of its land mass by 2081 if we don't do anything about sea level rises. I mean, England will become an archipelago of islands. It will just be like hills in amongst the sea. Another example of how climate change is affecting the landscape is, I touched upon it briefly before, is how tree plantations are causing soil degradation. And that's because humans like order. Humans like things to be kept in nice compartments and stable and everything in rows. And we see that in tree plantations. You know, I'm sure many of you will be driving back up to Scotland soon, and you'll be driving past many of these plantations, and you'll see lovely ordered rows of evergreens. What that basically means is that when we have extreme rainfall events, as are going to become more common in the future, we'll end up with water flow just going in between these trees and just rushing down. And that speed of water flow is going to completely strip the soil from those areas and just make it completely untenable to even grow trees there in the first place. It's just going to be bare rock, essentially, in the future. So a sort of take-home lesson is that when you're developing woodland areas within the courses that you manage, sort of make sure that it's not kept all nice and orderly. Make sure that it is kept with a little bit of a staggered, intermediate affair like this, so that when there is a sudden rainfall event, that forest will capture a lot more of the water. It will sort of force the water to divert about, slow it down, which is going to cause increase in sediment and soil buildup, hopefully. To give some actual numbers to the drier summers and the wetter winters, by 2070, it's predicted to have 41% drier summers and 22% wetter winters. So once again, we're looking at that increase in extremes, that much drier summers, much wetter winters, and we need to prepare for that now rather than in the future. Dry soils leading to downpours and water loss, and that's a good example of how humans are a landscape-affecting organism now. You know, we affect everything. We can't just let nature leave it be. So this is a little GIF I put in here this morning of exactly what a flash flood looks like in an incredibly dry environment. And you know, when we see this as people work within the UK and slightly more, this seems foreign to us. We don't see this in the UK, but this could become the norm by 2080. We could start seeing effects like this. And can you imagine that going down the middle of a fairway? It'd be disaster. You wouldn't be able to play on it for a year. It'll take forever to recover. So we discussed a little bit about how the landscape's going to change. We discussed a little bit about how sports turf's going to be affected. But what about the ecosystem? Well, ecosystem services are incredibly valuable to us. So we really want to try and maintain that and keep that as stable as possible. And unfortunately, that means fighting against ecosystems. Ecosystems want to change. That's what happens to them. You know, we have this idea in our heads that if we leave nature alone, it will get on and do its thing, and it will become fantastic trees and just stay stable. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. Before humans were about, everything was changing all the time. Big wildfires wiping out entire countries' worths of forests. All this all the time. Massive amounts of species and extinction events going on. And below, we have a very basic graph of what that looks like. You start off with bare rock. You get lichens coming in. That kind of gives you the little bit of soil that the vegetation can start growing off. And if you just leave it alone for a long period of time, eventually you end up with forest. England used to be nothing but forest. It used to be just birch, Yeah, birch oak forest, mostly. And so what we're doing as landscape managers is we're constantly fighting this. Whenever you go and you cut greens, that's essentially what you're doing. You're fighting the succession to keep things sustainable, to keep things stable. What we're finding now with climate change is that this whole process is beginning to reverse. As climate change disrupts ecosystems and landscapes, it can't keep up. Effectively, the climate change is doing your job for you. It's removing vegetation. It's trying to reverse everything back to bare rock. And so because of that, we're going to need to change our cultural practices and how we manage that grassland in order to keep it where we want. If we keep doing what we're doing, if we keep trying to fight against it going this way, what we're going to end up doing is just accelerate it going that way, which is what climate change is encouraging for it to do. Well, what might that involve? That might involve sort of changing the grass species that we see, sort of investigating new cultivars. Perhaps we need to shift our sort of cultivar development in a different direction to be much more drought tolerant. Sort of finer, more coastal grasses might become much more common on parkland courses, maybe. Those are the sort of changes that we might see coming ahead. Yeah, so in order to maintain good quality services, we'll need to revise the established cultural practices so that ecosystems are working towards the habitat we want rather than against it. So that's how the ecosystem is going to change, and the ecosystem is going to inevitably affect the ecology that we see. So this is a graph of what I was discussing earlier. So we've got millions of years along the bottom. Seems like a very long time, I know. And we have ice ages. But if you look, the average global temperatures, we're talking 30 degrees. It's an American graph, I'm afraid. It's 30 degrees Fahrenheit. But we're talking millions of years along the bottom. So what looks like a very sudden drop in this graph is actually an incredibly slow change. Now, if we go all the way to today, what we'll find is that we'll have almost a vertical line going up, showing the average increase in global temperatures. And our ecosystems just can't adapt fast enough to deal with that change, just can't deal with it fast enough. During all these ice ages, extinctions used to be normal. There didn't used to be humans about the place trying to keep everything stable, trying to keep everything perfect. We hear on the news all the time that, oh yeah, we're currently living through another extinction event. Species on the planet are dropping quicker than ever before. And while that is true, that process of species extinction isn't abnormal to the environment. In fact, it's quite normal. It's us as humans who see it as abnormal. It's us who wants to keep everything stable, who wants to keep everything the same. I think that's actually particularly relevant to golf courses. Golf clubs even. Golf clubs are, ancient institutions compared to a lot of what we have on the high street and a lot of what we interact with on a daily basis. Many golf courses have been around from the 18th century onwards. And so in that time, in the time that those golf courses have existed, they've seen all this change. But we want to try and keep them stable. We want to try to keep them golf courses when everything's fighting against that. Everything's trying to prevent it from being golf courses. So the two major differences from what we've seen in the past and now is humans. We're increasing the speed, increasing the rate at which things change, whilst at the same time fighting so hard to prevent that change. It seems very counterintuitive. And at the end of the day, the reason why we want to keep all the animals there, the reason why we like it all is to keep our ecosystem services in place, what I touched upon earlier. If we lose all of those ecosystem services, if the Earth became a blank rock with nothing but humans on it, society would just instantly collapse, essentially. And that's not something that we can have. In fact, back in the 1815, there was a year known as the Year Without Summer. This was probably caused by, we don't actually know, but it was probably caused by a volcanic eruption that caused soot in the atmosphere to essentially block out the sun and cause global temperatures to drop by an average of 2 degrees, which essentially just completely removed summer for that year. And there was massive famine and society completely collapsed. So when you lose the environment, society collapses, and when society collapses, your economy collapses just completely. This is another good example of how the change in temperature is going to affect ecosystems. So what we have here is a graph describing birds' nesting seasons and when they nest and when they try to have fledglings. The thing is that birds' nesting seasons is dependent on day length. They, during the winter time, it's dark most of the time. The birds know that this isn't a good time to have chicks. However, their food source, their main food source, caterpillars and invertebrates in general, don't care about day length. They care about temperature. That's how they decide when they're going to hatch and when they're going to pupate. So with this overall average increase in temperature, what we're seeing is that all the caterpillars are like, fantastic, we get a couple more weeks of breeding season, and all the birds are having a panic because all of a sudden all their food sources just disappeared. In fact, my master's dissertation was actually based on this, except I chose a much more boring subject. I chose midges. Don't ask me why. It was a mistake. And what I found during my study for that was pretty much exactly what this is saying here. If we heat up ponds to a temperature increase that's predicted to happen in 2050, we're going to find a doubling in the number of midges that are born 2 weeks earlier, and they're going to be much smaller. So when you're out having a walk, midges are going to be harder to hit, there's going to be twice as many of them to bite you, and there's going to be none of the birds or anything about to eat the ones that are trying to bite you. Midges are just going to become an absolute nightmare by 2050. So if you're going to invest in any stock, I recommend bug spray stock. I think that would be a good investment for the future. So once again, this is sort of looking at the world as a system, looking at ecosystems as a complete system, as part of the environment, as part of the weather patterns, and everything is just interconnected in ways that are really hard to predict. A lot of these studies, they've only been around for 10 years. You know, we didn't even know about this before 2000. It wasn't even on our radar. So I hope that's impressed upon you how climate change is going to affect essentially everything. But now it's not much of a good talk if I don't let you all go without explaining how potentially we could help mitigate against that. So, sustainable development for the future. What does that look like? What does that involve? It's all about maintaining a stable environment with minimal inputs. So, one of the best ways of maintaining a stable environment is to keep acting on it. We need to keep managing it exactly the same way that all landscape managers do, but we don't want to fight against ourselves. Now, what do I mean about fighting against ourselves? I mean having fertilizer runoff into rough areas that is causing increased growth, that's leading on to increase in invertebrates and pest species that are eating all your grasses on your fairways and on your greens. I mean when removing clippings, making sure that they're taken away and the nutrients that the clippings hold is kept and within the fairways and within the greens and not let out into the roughs, and basically just to make sure we're not fighting against ourselves. Below is a diagram of one of the ways which has started to become more common in golf courses, but I still find that there's occasionally a few greenkeepers who are not sure of them. That's a reed bed system. So right now a lot of golf courses have waste-to-water systems for washing down mowers and the such. They basically work by, you know, you wash all the clippings away, you got some bacteria that digest the clippings, you end up with a digestate, and it can be removed safely and much more efficiently. Reed beds do the same thing, but honestly, cheaper and more efficiently. Essentially, what they are is the same. You'll have all your clippings and everything run off into the reed bed, where they'll be broken down by bacteria, except all that extra nutrients is going to be put up into a series of reeds that are within the reed bed itself. Water flushing through as well. Reeds have very, very extensive root network systems. They can catch all the extra fertilizer, they can catch all the oil and keep it locked up there where it can be safely broken down by bacteria. And in terms of management, you need to cut the reeds maybe twice a year. That's it. And you got all those cut reeds and you just put it on the compost. That's absolutely, so that's a way that we can help reduce our inputs into the more of the overall environment. Sort of more on general terms, kind of I was sitting there when I was making this slide, I was kind of thinking about what is sustainable golf, how can we minimize impacts? Well, the appropriate use of pesticides is an obvious one. I think many people think that ecologists and environmentalists are completely against pesticides. It's not the case at all. It's just that pesticides are a bit of a hammer. They're really, really good at one specific thing, and we just don't want to accidentally knock down the entire building when we knock down the wall. So appropriate use of pesticides, not the banning or removal of pesticides. Maintaining woodland edges. So one of the ways which golf courses are really fantastic for the environment and for ecosystem services is that by their very nature, by their very design, they have a lot of what's known as interface habitats. Sorry, I'm going a bit deep into ecological theory here. But basically, there's a lot of habitats next to other habitats. It's very, very rare for any one species to be just a woodland bird. It's very rare to have a bird that just stays within the woodlands. It will probably breed in the woodlands and then feed on your fairways or feed somewhere that, acting as a very valuable pest removal system that you don't have to pay for and looks great while we're at it. Understanding the local environment. So this is something which sort of feeds back into the earth as a system. Your golf course is what you manage. That's great. But there is a habitat outside there, and it does extend beyond. So we need to be looking at a slightly wider perspective and figuring out how we can keep our the golf courses that you manage relatable to the surrounding environment and sympathetic with the surrounding environment. And in return, what that will give you back is greater biodiversity, more birds on site, more of this natural pesticide, you could say, that's going to come on and help reduce your maintenance costs. There's a lot of golf courses that use local interest groups to monitor the site. So what that basically means is, sort of getting a better idea of what you have on site, what you should be managing for, like sort of what direction should be aiming management. Do you have a particularly rare bird on site, which provides a very valuable resource to the maintenance of your course? Perhaps a lot of you have that, and you don't even realize. Another one is that a lot of the bad practices that I've been hearing about tend to be spurred on, and perhaps I'm putting words in your mouth here, but tend to be spurred on by a worry that members are going to negatively react to whatever you're doing. So one of the ways around that is to have course walks, is to keep that communication up with members really, really well, to have them understand, to reduce the anxiety essentially in doing many of these processes in the first place, which may not seem immediately obvious why we're changing how we're acting in the first place. Write a 5-year management plan. Well, that's just common sense. That's just, having a good management plan in place is going to make things sustainable. It's going to make things more economically efficient. You're able to think about how you're going to get a digger in, and perhaps when that digger's in, we can do that other bit of work that we were thinking about. Minimizing the length of the supply chain. I mean, a lot of these are quite obvious, but I hope that by reading some of these, it will spark just a little interest in your mind, and you go, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Perhaps we could do that. Yeah. So there are, however, a lot of ecological and environmental enhancements that we can perform which aren't always immediately obvious. Now, this may seem out of keeping. This particular picture may seem out of keeping for a lot of golf courses, but it is something that perhaps you could roll into greenkeeping facilities or somewhere that's slightly more out of the way. So this is a green roof. Sorry, excuse me. So a lot of the habitat change is caused by disturbance, by people walking over things, by the crushing of flowers and things like that. If you have all those flowers and all that habitat on a roof, no one's going to walk over them. No one's going to disturb them. You aren't going to get any pesticides up there, or at least I hope not. There's not going to be any fertilizer up there. So what you're going to have is a section of habitat that's going to provide a seed for producing butterflies and caterpillars and a lot more of these higher level species that provide a lot of these ecosystem services that we were talking about earlier, that then can spread out to the rest of the site, so that they're all spread out. So whilst it might be a very, very small area, it can provide a large amount of service and generally increase biodiversity as a whole. This one might not be so obvious. They're very common on farms, but they're not so common in golf courses. But this is another one of these examples of something which has become quite common on farms, and I don't understand why it's not more common on golf courses. This is an anaerobic reactor. anaerobic digester. So what this basically is another alternative way of creating mulch and fertilizer on course. The fundamental difference between this and a traditional composting system is that this is done in the absence of oxygen. So what does that mean? That means that we're going to have some microbes living within there, which we don't normally get within a compost system, which produce a lot of methane, which produce a lot of heat. We can then siphon that methane off and use it to run power plants. In fact, STRI did a feasibility scheme on a series of football training grounds, which had a mown area similar to many golf courses. And they found that with a little bit of community engagement, supplying their own biomass, they could actually run their entire training facility off just the electricity gained from their clippings. Seems like a no-brainer. It's good for the environment, very little land use. You can make these. The other interesting thing about these is that they're completely scalable. I think they built one on a lamppost somewhere along the south coast where people put their dog poop into it, and that powered the lamppost. Is dog poop in a lamppost? Who would have guessed in the future? So these guys are a really, really good option. They have quite a large initial investment, depending on the kind of size you're going for, not because of the anaerobic digester section of it, but because they tend to come with a specialized turbine that's used that runs off methane, and that tends to be the expensive part. So if perhaps you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, oh, actually, we have one of these just down the road, perhaps we could go and deposit our clippings there. Perhaps that can be a good way of removing some of the excess clippings from the site. By removing the excess clippings from the site, we're removing the overall nutrient load that we're putting into all the rough areas, and generally unfertilized rough and unfertilized area is going to be more natural and have a greater biodiversity. This is a really useful website, which I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Magic, actually, in the room. Just one? Magic is a really useful, completely free resource. So it's literally Magic. It's run by DEFRA. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to search for protected and statutory sites and species designations within your local area. So in this case, I've just chosen a random golf club. And down the left-hand side, you can select Ramsar sites. Actually, that's another question. Are people familiar with what sites of special scientific interest are? So these are areas which are specially designated by the government because they are particularly good for wildlife. And what you can do is you can find your own golf course that you manage, and you can have a look at the surrounding area and see if there is any area around you that's, this area is particularly protected for orchids, for particularly the species of orchid. That's interesting. Perhaps we can encourage that orchid on a site. Perhaps we should be managing our roughs in this particular way because it will encourage this particularly rare orchid on site. So this is all part of looking at the earth and looking at the environment as a complete system, not just individual, this is the course that's managed and that's it. So the last thing I wanted to say was that, sort of staying with the everything as a system theme, a lot of what we do to help prevent climate change isn't actually too great for ecology. And a lot of what we do for ecology isn't actually too great for the environment. And they're very often in conflict to each other. And this is just kind of like adding a layer of complexity on top of everything that we just talked about. So hydroelectric dams, fantastic source of energy, used all around the world, but have been known to completely decimate fish populations. Wind turbines, once again, absolutely fantastic. But I think on average, a wind turbine will take out 2 predatory birds a year and about 10 bats, because bats are a bit silly and they just run straight into them. They're not smart creatures. So when deciding to make any of these changes to your course, when looking at that reactor, that digester and thinking, oh, that's a really good idea, that's a really good source of renewable energy, always just keep in mind that it's going to cause a list of changes, of effects that affects the whole site as a total. So in summary, I'll just let you read this. Basically, hopefully, what we've talked about today has sort of sparked your interest in looking at the environment as more of a global thing, about how everything's interconnected, sparked your interest a little bit more into climate change, into how, excuse me, into how climate change will be affecting sports turf, you guys directly, and some of the ways in which we can manage and mitigate that change, and why, as landscape managers, often what we're doing is fighting against nature, and what we need to be doing is sort of working with it to hopefully maintain it and keep it at the level that we want. I'm just going to, oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, and then these are 3 websites. They're really, really good for keeping up to date on top of climate change research. It is an ongoing subject. We don't know everything yet. I mean, as I said, just 10 years ago, we didn't even think about how climate change was going to affect bird populations, and now we're seeing a decimation of our farmland birds across the world. And hopefully, these are 3 websites that will give you a lot of information to help you keep on top of things. And lastly, I'm going to leave you with this sentence. I personally think that this might be the most damaging sentence ever to be uttered, because it is a single sentence that will single-handedly paralyze an entire group of people of doing any sort of action and helping any of this. I was talking with a couple of greenkeepers yesterday, and both times I sort of got on the topic of climate change. They both mentioned this. Sure, we could change everything, we could fix everything, we could keep things maintained, we could keep the environment stable and support our society and support our economy, but no one else will, because everyone else is thinking about the money first rather than the environment. So it will never happen. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous way of thinking. And I'm going to end quite a lot of my talks with just thinking about this and thinking about how we could flip this on its head. How, if everyone just thought to themselves, yeah, I will do that little bit, I will just increase the sustainability of my course that little bit, we can all come together and then we can all see a change. And then we can go, oh, that worked. And then we can all carry on and keep it rolling. So thank you very much for listening to me ramble on for 55 minutes. We have 5 minutes of questions. If anyone has any immediate questions, feel free to raise your hand, shout out, do a little dance, whatever. No? OK, well, thank you very much for attending. I hope everyone's found it useful. Yeah, and thank you very much. Please. Please, if you have got any questions, but just didn't want to stand up and say it in the middle of a group, do send me an email. I try to reply to all my emails. Send a tweet if you liked what you saw here. If you didn't like what you saw here, don't. Yeah, that's grand. Thank you very much.